Hi guys, welcome to the new year and welcome to History 4th year. This is the Unit 5, Imperialism, War and Revolution. This is a long unit and it's very important because it explains how the world is distributed today. So what happened more than 100 years ago has a direct influence on what we are living nowadays. Countries in the world. This unit has 3 parts. 1. Imperialism. 2. The World War I. And 3. The Russian revolutions. The 19th and beginning of 20th century imperialism led to the beginning of our current problem. The First World War displayed the way Europe was distributed, the way nowadays Europe is distributed. And the Russian revolutions and the Russian Civil War displayed the new ideologies that are going to fight during the 20th and 21st century. It's the beginning of the rivalry between the United States, Russia, and China, our current world powers. So, let's start. Of course, you remember we studied 3 different types of systems of governments during the unit about the old regime, unit number 1. Absolute monarchy, English parliamentary system, or parliamentary monarchy, and republic. Now, studying the 19th century systems of government, we can classify them into 2. Authoritarian political systems and liberal political systems. The authoritarian political systems had these characteristics. The ruler was a king who had all the power. If parliaments existed, they had no power at all. Militarism was usual. These countries used to be multi-ethnic countries, such as the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Ottoman Empire. And people living in these countries had few individual rights. The liberal political systems had different characteristics. The principle of separation of powers was the key to limit the government's power and to achieve a more fair society. Suffrage existed and was extended to achieve the universal male suffrage. People living in these countries had important individual rights, such as freedom of expression or the right of assembly. And socialist parties started being part of parliaments due to the right of vote for the workers. Industrialization in non-European countries played an important role. Let's study the 3 most important ones: United States, Russia, and Japan. Russian Empire was so big that it didn't depend on other countries' resources. So in Russia, the autocracy was the way of working, the system of government. Actually, it was an empire with an emperor called the Tsar. The Tsar held all powers. He was the head of the state, he was the head of the government, he was the head of the church because he was the highest religious authority of the Orthodox Church. Russian society was an old regime society, privileged and non-privileged social states. The nobility were the owners of large lands with hundreds or thousands of serfs living and working there. Noblemen were the higher officials of the army and they held top positions in the government. The non-privileged states were workers in cities and peasants, the majority of population actually. Living conditions of peasants were extremely hard because they were serfs under an absolute control by their lord. The Tsar Alexander II issued a decree conceding the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. The goal was to give freedom to the serfs, to improve their living conditions, but actually their economic situation was so horrible, so hard, that their living conditions improved almost nothing. Russian Empire was a multi-ethnic country because it was inhabited by Russians, Ukrainians, Armenians, Turks, Chechens, Kazakhs, Belarusians, Yakuts, Germans, Uzbeks, and a very long etc. The United States was a large country with few population. Most of its inhabitants were located on the east coast, and soon they started expanding westwards to colonize new territories. This process was known as the westwards expansion. Western territories were populated by natives who opposed this expansion, and as a consequence, few natives survived to this expansion, and they were confined on reservations. By 1860, the United States were formed by 34 states. The states of the United States of North America were divided into two types: industrial and trading states, northern states, and agriculture states, the southern states. The southern states, specialized in agriculture activities, were based on large plantations, worked by a large workforce of black people who arrived to America as slaves from Africa, or descendants of African slaves. A crisis happened when Abraham Lincoln became president of the country in 1860, because he intended to abolish slavery everywhere, as it had happened in northern states. Southern states, of course, opposed the new president and left the Union, creating a confederation of states. A war started when Southern States Army attacked Fort Sumter in Charleston Bay in April 12, 1861, claiming this United States fort as their own.
April 14, 1861. Fort Sumter, founded by Confederate batteries, surrenders. Lincoln's response is immediate. The next day, he called for 75,000 volunteers for military service. Recruitment stations were flooded with men eager to put down the rebellion. But things were different in the border states. The governors of Kentucky and Missouri refused to contribute troops. And as more states sided with the South, Lincoln's problems only increased. The president chose a Virginian to lead Union forces, but was turned down when Virginia seceded. In time, the man would become the South's most famous general, Robert E. Lee.
The President Lincoln, of course, called out the militia to suppress this insurrection, and 4 more slave states seceded and joined the Confederacy. By the end of 1861, nearly 1 million armed men confronted each other. The war lasted for 5 years. It was called the American Civil War. But due to the fact that the southern states seceded the Union, in Spanish it was called Guerra de Secesión. The northern states won the war, and finally slavery was abolished, although black people's rights were different than white ones. These different rights for white and black people in southern states was known as racial segregation, and it lasted for more than 100 years. When we studied industrialization in Japan, we studied that the emperor, Meiji Tenno, was the one who started this industrialization, the one who ended the feudalism in Japan. So between 1867 and 1914, Japan became an industrialized country with a high Western influence, but the emperor remained being an absolute monarch. Nevertheless, the emperor ended the traditional policy of isolation of Japan in order to reach trade agreements with Western countries, the United States and European countries mainly. The rise of imperialism. We know the concept empire. and it is related to the concept imperialism. This concept is actually a policy of a country. It consists of extending domination over other territories. Actually, it's a conquering of territory. The conquering country is called mother country, and the conquered territory is called colony. Imperialism was usual during the modern age, when European kingdoms conquered territories with weak monarchies, or just without some form of state. Spain and Portugal built empires with territories in America, Africa, and Asia. And Dutch Republic, France, and Britain did the same too.
In two, they can move. And so then Green's going to go ahead and decide who else he wants to attack. And let's just say he decides he's done attacking everybody.
During the Second Industrial Revolution, the need of new sources of energy and the expansion of international trade, thanks to the transports revolution, marked the beginning of a new phase. Colonies of Spain in America became independent during the 19th century, and by the end of the century, Spain lost its remaining colonies in America, Cuba and Puerto Rico, and Asia, the Philippines. Britain and France extended their colonies very fast, taking control of large territories in Asia and Africa. Germany, Italy, Belgium, Russia, the United States, and Japan joined this imperial expansion. In 100 years, territories controlled by European countries and the United States grew from 35% of Earth's land to 84%. Only 2 countries in Africa remained independent by 1914, Ethiopia and Liberia. The 3 main powers in Asia, the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and China, remain independent countries, but actually they were forced to grant trade advantages to Japan, Russia, United States, and European countries. Now we must study the factors of imperialism. They were economic, demographic, religious, political, ideological, and scientific factors. Imperial powers used their controlled territories to obtain raw materials, paying a very cheap price, and to sell their industrial products for a very expensive price, of course. You remember how the Industrial Revolution provoked a mechanization of the agricultural activities. As a consequence, plenty of agricultural workers were not necessary anymore. These people had to emigrate, and some chose the colonies. Europeans believed their culture and religion as the only true one, so they considered other cultures, and other religions of course, very primitive. Conversion into Christianity of native populations in Africa and Asia became a main goal for Europeans and a way of legitimation for their imperialist control. They would say, yes, we must control these primitive people to teach them the true religion. 3 were the political factors: geostrategy, competition, and prestige. According to their economic interests, imperial powers needed to control specific areas. For example, the communications of the huge extension of the British Empire, with territories in Asia, Africa, Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, made the existence of harbors and territories to supply the British merchant and military boats with coal, water and food completely necessary. This geostrategy was important during the 19th century and nowadays. Just have a look at these United States naval bases, or French, or British, or Russian. The economic profits provided by the colonies boost the competition between industrialized countries to colonize new territories, sometimes just to prevent other country to increase its power. One idea spread among European people: the more territories your country controls, the more important your country is. So European people supported colonialism based on nationalist ideology. Europeans believed in the superiority of white race, so other people in Asia and Africa were considered primitive, and Europeans had the duty to civilize them. Of course, this duty of civilizing people brought the right of ruling over these people. Scientists developed expeditions all over the world. In this way, they also contributed to imperialism, because the country that organized and financed the expedition, after they had explored a territory, country claimed the right to conquer it and, of course, to rule it and exploit it. The Great Colonial Empires. The first colonial empires were created during the 16th century by Portuguese and Spanish, but by the end of the 19th century, these countries lost completely their influence. Now the important countries were Britain, France, United States, Russia, Germany, and Japan. The most important and largest power in the earth was the British Empire. British colonies were distributed all over the world, and the main one was India. The great distance between the British Islands and India was solved with plenty of other territories colonized along the route. In this way, Britain took control of the Suez Canal and other key locations to secure the shortest route to India. Britain also had possessions along the coast of Africa and islands of the Atlantic Ocean to secure an alternative route surrounding Africa. Due to the intention of linking colonies from North and South of Africa, Britain came into a conflict with France. It was called the Fashoda Incident. By 1898, France wanted to extend its empire east to west, from the Niger River in West Africa to the Nile in East Africa, in order to control all trade. And Britain wanted to link its territory north to south, from present-day Cape Town, South Africa, to Cairo, Egypt, in order to establish a railroad over the entire length of the African continent. These two imperial powers' ambitions intersected in the city of Fashoda. Both countries understood: whoever controls Fashoda controls the entire African continent. Seeing no advantage in a colonial war with Britain, the French ultimately decided to withdraw its soldiers from Fashoda on 3rd November 1898. France and Britain agreed that the watershed of the Nile and the Congo, respectively, should mark the boundaries between their spheres of influence. Along with possessions in Asia and Africa, Britain also controlled Canada in America and much of Oceania. France created the second largest empire in the world. France conquered Algeria and Tunisia, created a protectorate in Morocco, and conquered territories in Central and Western Africa and Asia, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Other countries created colonies in Africa. Germany, Italy, and Belgium created also colonies in Africa, and Russia expanded its border to the east, conquering Siberia. After the Spanish-United States War in 1898, the United States acquired the Spanish territories in Asia, the Philippines, and in America, Puerto Rico and Cuba. Although the United States did not conquer military Central and South America, actually they established an economic domination. This economic domination was called the Monroe's Doctrine, after the President of the United States in 1823, James Monroe. Monroe's Doctrine stated, "Further efforts by European nations to take control of any independent state in North or South America would be viewed as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States of America." It means America for the Americans, for the North Americans, actually. Japan was an overpopulated country that needed raw materials and resources from abroad, and that led to a conflict with its closest neighbors, Russia and China. Japan conquered the islands of Formosa, nowadays Taiwan, and the Chinese region of Manchuria. Colonial expansion meant conflicts between colonial powers. To solve these conflicts, the great colonial powers met at the Berlin Conference, 1884-1885. At this meeting, the colonial powers came into an agreement and divided up the entire African continent. Colonial rule. Colonies were not exactly the same everywhere. Colonial powers established three types of ruling: colonies, protectorates, and spheres of influence. Colonies were territories without sovereignty. Do you remember the concept sovereignty? In Europe, we studied how the king's sovereignty was transformed into national sovereignty. That meant the king was the owner of the country, and later the national sovereignty meant that people, citizens, we are the owners of the country. Colonies did not have sovereignty because they were a possession of the mother country. Mother country controlled absolutely everything. Examples of colonies were the Belgian Congo, New Zealand, Fiji, Papua, Burma, Myanmar nowadays. Protectorates were another category of colonization. Now the colonial power controlled the foreign policy and the main economic activities. Native authorities had control over domestic policy, local administration, local security, town halls. Examples of protectorates were Somaliland, nowadays Somalia, Cyprus, Gibraltar, Brunei, Egypt, Sudan. Last category of colonization was the sphere of influence. It wasn't an actual colonization because the territory had independence, but these territories were forced to grant trade advantages to the colonial powers. China was the most typical example. British authorities traded with opium that had horrible consequences for Chinese population. But when the Chinese government declared opium illegal, the British government declared war on China. And after bombing several cities, the Chinese government was forced to sit and allow the opium trading. Colonialism had a big influence on politics until today. Territories were distributed among and by colonial powers without considering native populations. They did not consider linguistic differences or religious, cultural, social, historical. Because of that, colonial powers draw the borders of these territories, causing a lot of conflicts in the past, in the present, and in the future. The economy of the colonies was based on the extraction of minerals and plantation agriculture. Private companies from colonial countries exploited the extraction of minerals, gold, diamonds, and coal, and created large plantations of rubber, coffee, and tea. The workforce in these plantations and mines was composed by native people, working under very hard conditions and for very low salaries. Few infrastructures were created in colonies. These infrastructures were created by the mother country, but just to benefit the mother country's interests. Usually these infrastructures were railways and ports aimed to transport the production of the plantations and minerals from mines to the mother country transport boats. Colonization had a great impact on societies from colonized territories. Demography in these territories was affected by the colonization. The first and most important example was the Spanish colonization in America and its demographic consequence during the 15th and 16th century. Amerindians, Indians from America, were not used to the European illnesses and thousands died. The same happened in the 19th century to population in Africa, Asia, and Oceania. Diseases, wars, extreme work exploitation decreased the number of native population, while colonizers settled in these new territories. So, demography just changed. The colonizers who settled in the colonies formed a new social class, a new elite. They controlled the economy and the government, and natives were considered inferior, and therefore marginalized, living in separate areas and working on the hardest works. The colonizers, as social elite, of course, imposed their culture and their way of living. The few indigenous social elite became westernized by imitating the colonizers' way of living, studying in European universities, and acquiring their languages, clothes, and religion. The causes of World War I. The First World War started in 1914 and affected millions of people and countries. But why this war started and how? Of course, you remember when we studied the French-German War and the creation, the unification of Germany after the defeat of France. Unit 2.8, the unification of Germany. Do you remember the picture we saw, the proclamation of the Reich in Versailles Palace?
Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles, in der Welt.
Germany became a military and economic power. The German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck created several alliances to maintain certain balance in European politics. Actually, the German goals were to isolate France and maintain an equilibrium in the Balkans. France was the main enemy of Germany because they shared a border, and both countries had an interest in controlling the Alsace-Lorraine area. This area was an industrial zone reaching goal that belonged to Germany since the defeat of France in 1870. Of course, Germans feared the French may want to take back this territory, and that's the reason Bismarck tried to isolate France. Balkans region was complicated too, because different countries had interests there. The most powerful ones were two empires, Russian and Austria-Hungarian Empire. To avoid a war, and because Bismarck feared that a hostile combination of Austria, France and Russia would crush Germany, he created his series of alliances called the Bismarckian Alliance System, Sistemas Bismarckianos. They consisted of dual alliance, Germany, Austria, Hungary. Later, when Italy joined them, it became the Triple Alliance, and the League of the Three Emperors, Wilhelm I of Germany, Francis Joseph of Austria-Hungary, and the Tsar Alexander II of Russia. These alliances lasted since 1871 for almost 20 years, but they came into an end when the German Kaiser died, and his successor, Wilhelm II, changed completely his policy. The new Kaiser was more aggressive. He replaced Bismarck and started a period of armed peace since 1890 to 1914. During this period, all European countries increased the size and power of their armies and weapons. The European powers divided into two blocks: the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria and Italy, and the Triple Entente, Russia, France and Britain. Not only the antagonism France-Germany was a source of conflict, the imperialism and the colonialism was a source of conflicts too, because Italy and Germany had few colonies, and they wanted to acquire more. Of course, Britain and France wanted to limit this German and Italian expansion. To weaken France, Germany encouraged the independence of Morocco, but the Algeciras Conference confirmed the French protectorate, and in 1912, Britain impulsed the Spanish protectorate, just to limit the French power in northern Africa. Another source of conflict was the Eastern question. The Ottoman Empire was falling apart. The closest empires, Russia and Austria-Hungary, wanted to increase their influence in the region, taking advantage of this falling apart of the Ottoman Empire. Austria, for example, wanted to expand along the coast of the Adriatic Sea, and to limit the Austrian power, Russia supported the Slavic states, Serbia and Bulgaria, to maintain their independence and not to come under the Austrian power. Anyway, a series of wars led to changes in this region. Bosnia-Herzegovina was annexed by Austria-Hungary, and most of Bulgaria was divided up among other countries. The period of the armed peace finished when the heir of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated in Sarajevo. The Serbian nationalist group, the Black Hand, killed the Archduke on 28 June 1914, and Austria-Hungary used this event to issue an ultimatum to Serbia, considering responsible for the assassination. Serbia rejected the ultimatum, and Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. For sure, you want to know the terms of this ultimatum. Don't worry. We are going to work about it because it's one of the text commentaries we will be working in class. At that moment, the game of alliances started. Russia, allied of Serbia, mobilized its army to support its ally. Then Germany, in order to support Austria, declared war on Russia and France, the ally of Russia. When Germany invaded Belgium to go to France, Britain, the ally of France and Belgium, declared war on Germany. Italy, the third ally of Germany and Austria-Hungary, withdrew from the Triple Alliance and remained neutral for a while. Let's summarize the causes of this war watching this video.
You may be aware of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This was, in fact, the trigger which set off the war from a number of underlying causes. These were militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Militarism created an arms race out of competition and fear of neighbouring nations. Germany tried to compete in a naval race with Britain, building more and more ships. Alliances were created to check the balance of power between nations. In 1882, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy formed the Triple Alliance. France, Britain, and Russia reacted in 1907 by creating the Triple Entente. Imperialism caused another type of competition and disagreement. The British and French empires made Germany jealous as it tried to colonize parts of Africa. Nationalism created the feeling that countries were better than others and promoted the anti-Austro-Hungarian sentiments in Serbia.
The course of war. The war was initially European, but when colonies sent troops and other countries from abroad, China, Japan, United States, or the Ottoman Empire, joined the war, this one became World War. Sides were conformed by the Triple Alliance, now without Italy, and the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. Triple Alliance without Italy is not triple, so it will be called also Central Powers. Anyway, these alliances got new members. To the Triple Alliance, the Ottoman Empire or Bulgaria, and to the Triple Entente, also called the Allies, Romania, Greece, the United States, China, and Japan. Germany had a plan for the war, designed by the General Alfred von Schlieffen in 1905. This plan consists of invading France, defeat France very quickly, and then go to invade Russia. The Schlieffen plan was successful at the beginning and the German army arrived near Paris. But finally, the French stopped the Germans at the Battle of the Marne. Russia attacked the east of Germany, and then German troops from France were sent to the east, and the invasion of France stopped completely. All of this happened in 1914 in just 2 months, August and September. It was called the War of Movement. Since September, a new phase of the war started. It was called the War of Positions. Trenches and machine guns stabilized the fronts. Soldiers had terrible living conditions in trenches, and hundreds of thousands died of illnesses and ineffective attacks. There were 2 important offensives in 1916. The Battle of Verdun by the Germans and the Battle of the Somme by the British and French army. These battles were extremely harsh. More than 700,000 soldiers were killed in Verdun and more than 1 million in the Somme. These offensives were completely ineffective, and neither side advanced their positions. The war ran in other regions too. Other offensives were, for example, a British one, with the help of Arab nationalists, against the Ottoman Empire. This offensive led to the occupation of Ottoman possessions in the Near East, and the try of taking the Dardanelles Strait, although Allied troops were defeated at the Battle of Gallipoli. German colonies were also conquered by the British army in Africa and by the Japanese army in Asia, and seas were controlled by the powerful British Navy, although the Germans developed the submarine warfare to counterattack. Although the war remained bloody stabilized, in 1917 2 events had important consequences. One was the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and the other one, the entrance of the United States in the war. In Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution led to the collapse of the Russian Western Front. So, Russia signed a peace treaty with Germany in March 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Then, German troops from the Eastern Front, the German Eastern Front, reinforced the Western Front. Italy joined the war, but sided not on its previous allies, Germany and Austro-Hungary, but joined the British-French side. Anyway, the turning point was the entrance of the United States, the intervention of the United States. With the help of the United States supplies and armies, the Allies attacked all fronts, and the Central Powers surrendered. The armistice was signed at 11 o'clock on 19th November 1918. The war was over. Consequences of World War I. Human consequences were the most horrible humanity had ever seen. Between 15 and 20 million people died during the war, and we don't know the exact number of injured people or disappeared people. Economic consequences focus on destruction of towns, crop fields, and mines in northeast France, Belgium, and northern Italy. The costs of war were also high for Britain and France, so they took borrow a great amount of money from the United States during the years of the war. It wasn't actually money, it was supplies. Weapons, food, oil, minerals, and chemical products were borrowed from the United States, and as a consequence, Europe acquired a very huge debt. Political consequences were established during the Paris Peace Conference. This conference was aimed at signing different peace treaties between the winner and loser countries. The Allies and Central Powers signed different treaties. These treaties were named after the towns and cities where they were signed. Versailles, it was the treaty signed with Germany, Saint-Germain with Austria, Trianon with Hungary, Sèvres with Turkey, and Neuilly with Bulgaria. The treaties were imposed by the winner countries to the defeat ones. Consequently, main decisions were taken by the United States, France, Britain, and Italy. And conditions were very hard on loser countries. The main goals of these conditions were to prevent the resurgence of Germany. The last wars proved it to be a very dangerous country for France. To achieve a balance of power among the winner countries, to avoid future conflicts between them. Remember, there was a colonial rivalry between France and Britain. And to isolate Russia. In this country, after the Bolshevik Revolution, a communist regime was established, and the Allies, capitalist countries, feared that the eventual spread of this revolution and kind of economic system could affect them. After the war, countries realized the world needed one kind of organization to avoid future conflicts. The President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, tried to create an international organization to regulate international relationships and to maintain peace through diplomacy instead of wars. This organization was called the League of Nations. The idea was great, but finally the Congress of the United States did not agree with their president. So United States, Russia, and Germany did not join this organization, and without these important powers, League of Nations was ineffective. Territorial changes were a direct consequence of war.
On June 28, 1919, a peace treaty is signed at Versailles. German representatives are not invited, and the country is forced to accept all demands of the victors. Germany and its allies are held solely responsible for war damages and must pay heavy compensation. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman empires are dismantled, making way for new countries or colonies. Germany, meanwhile, finds itself humiliated and indebted. Its army is disbanded and colonies shared among the allies. The country cedes roughly 15% of its territory to France, Belgium, Denmark, and Poland, which is recreated. The only consolation is Germany remains largely intact due to no fighting on its territory, and its industry is still standing. The humiliation imposed upon Germany already leaves it with a desire for revenge.
The Treaty of Versailles considered Germany as the origin of the war, the cause of the war, so a penalty was given to Germany. Germany had to pay war reparations, very high war reparations. The origins of the Russian Revolution. We'll change now the subject. Let's focus on Russia. Back to the beginning of the 20th century, before the First World War started, the Russian Empire still existed, and it was an absolute monarchy under the authority of a Tsar, an emperor, who held an absolute power as head of the state, head of the government, and head of the Orthodox Church. It existed a parliament, it was called Duma, but it had no power at all. Politically, there was no opposition to the Tsar, because people had neither individual nor political rights, of course. The economy of Russia was based on agriculture. The industrialization had started based on the railway and the heavy industry, and made the creation of a proletariat possible. However, most of the population were peasants, and these peasants lived under very hard conditions, imposed by the nobility, who were the owners of the lands. Most of Russian population in urban and rural areas lived in poverty. So by the end of the 19th century, a kind of opposition started. This opposition against the Tsar produced different political parties, clandestine political parties. The Socialist Revolutionary Party, the Constitutional Democratic Party, and the Russian Socialist Democratic Workers' Party. The Socialist Revolutionary Party was made up of agricultural workers and wanted to collectivize lands. The Constitutional Democratic Party didn't want any revolution, just to transform Russia into a constitutional monarchy. And the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party split into two groups: the Mensheviks, who were moderate and wanted to make a gradual transition to a socialist system of government, and the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov Lenin, who were radicals and wanted to establish a proletarian dictatorship through a workers' revolution. Remember the first part of this unit, when we studied the imperialism. According to the imperialist ideas, Russia tried to expand its territory to the east, and that led into a conflict with Japan, and therefore to a war. Russia was defeated at this war, and at the same time suffered a hard economic crisis. The two facts together led to riots and finally to the revolution of 1905. This revolution started just a demonstration in January 1905. Just people went to the Tsar's palace, the Winter's palace, asking for better living conditions. Most of the demonstrators were women, children, and old men. A military force repressed the demonstration by shooting at the people, and plenty of people were killed. It was called the Bloody Sunday. People reacted, and strikes and more demonstrations happened everywhere. Peasants and workers met in assemblies to discuss the way of acting. These assemblies were called Soviets. Tsar realized the growing opposition, so he made few political concessions. The most important one was the decision of conforming the Duma via universal male suffrage, pretending his absolute monarchy was being transformed into a parliamentary monarchy, constitutional monarchy. These concessions were published in a manifesto, the October Manifesto. The Constitutional Democratic Party and the Mensheviks agreed to this manifesto. However, the Tsar continued ruling without Duma, so Russia continued being an absolute monarchy. The revolutions of 1917 and the Russian Civil War. The revolution of 1905 finished with the Tsar's conditions, but 9 years later, Russia joined the First World War, the Great War, and situation changed drastically. Food supplies were scarce, and soldiers and people were starving. At the same time, the German army was defeating the Russian armies, battle after battle. Soldiers were killed by thousands. People protested, and they were severely repressed. A demonstration on 8th March 1917 led to a revolution. The slogan was "Peace, Bread and Land." Workers went to a general strike, and soldiers mutinied. So a new government was formed. It was a moderate socialist government, led by Alexander Kerensky, aimed to establish a liberal political system. The Tsar Nicholas II, did not agree with a liberal system, so he abdicated. But the new government faced different problems. One of them were the Soviets. These associations of workers, had their own paramilitary groups, and these were led by Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, by Lenin. Lenin wanted a more radical political change than Kerensky. Lenin returned to Russia from his 10 years exile in Zurich and proposed a new political program. It was called the April Thesis. This program was based on different measures: withdrawal from the war, redistribution of land among peasants, control of factories by workers' committees, autonomy for the national minorities, and Soviet government. Kerensky's provisional government reacted and accused Lenin of organizing a riot that happened in July. Lenin fled from Russia, although he was not the origin of this riot. Actually, this insurrection was originated in the bad living conditions that still existed in Russia and the defeats of the Russian army in the World War I. Anyway, Lenin went back to exile and fled from Russia. 3 months later, Lenin went back to St. Petersburg, now named Petrograd. There he joined the Soviet of Petrograd and claimed all the power to the Soviets. It was the beginning of the October Revolution. The Bolsheviks, who controlled the Soviets, took over the city and formed a new government. Kerensky went to exile. The new government took very important measures. Russia withdrew from World War I after signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Properties from the nobility were confiscated and its land distributed to the peasants. Factories were given to assemblies of workers to control, and the right of sovereignty was given to the different nationalities that existed in Russia. The Bolshevik government faced a huge opposition: Tsarists and liberals. The Tsarists, including lot owners, military commanders, and the Orthodox Church, and the liberals, created an army to fight against the Bolshevik Revolution. It was called the White Army, that faced the government's one, the Red Army. A civil war started and lasted from 1918 to 1921, when finally the Red Army won the war. After the civil war, a communist dictatorship was established. The Bolshevik Party, now named the Communist Party, was the only legal one, the only one who held the power. All other political parties were completely banned. This communist dictatorship, this communist regime, will be the origin of the future conflicts in the world. It's the beginning of a new era, the beginning of new problems, and the beginning of our current world.